there was an elephant not in the room, if you will, during the debate on June 27th, and that was RFK Jr., the leading third-party candidate for the presidency. There was one thing many speculated. What would have happened had RFK Jr. participated in that debate? Many say he would have done better than Biden, or even Trump in that debate, and maybe would have gained support. But nonetheless, the results of the debate have caused RFK Jr. to surpass 10% in some major polls. So with that being said, what if Biden drops out of the race and RFK Jr. takes up the Democratic nomination? Since at one point he was polling at about 20% in Democratic primary polls. So let's see what would happen if it's a head-to-head race between RFK Jr. and Donald Trump for the presidency. So luckily for us, there have been a slew of polls conducted on this hypothetical scenario, most of which were actually conducted by the RFK Jr. camp, so it's not really totally indicative of what would actually happen. But regardless, let's go to the safe states for both parties. So RFK Jr. would win the state of California, he'd win Hawaii, he'd win Illinois, he'd win New York, he'd win Vermont, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, D.C., Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, as well as Maine's 1st Congressional District. These are generally considered the safe states for the Democrats, along with Washington and Oregon, but I don't know if those states would be totally safe for RFK Jr. if he's running. One thing to know is RFK Jr.'s home state is New York. He was actually once pretty much vetted to be a senator from New York, and even though he chose not to, his father was actually a senator from New York, Robert F. Kennedy, and his father was very popular in the state of New York, which is part of the reason RFK Jr. does so well in the Northeast. So with that being said, Trump would win Trump's safe states, which are Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. I don't know if we could say Utah just yet. Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Nebraska's 1st, Nebraska's 3rd, Kansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and West Virginia. The reason we can't include Utah is because Utah is generally considered more of an independently minded state. Utah voted for independent candidate Evan McMullin with about 20% of the vote back in 2016. As you can see here, McMullin took a large portion of the vote away from Trump, and Utah used to have Mitt Romney as a senator, and Mitt Romney, you may know, is one of the biggest opponents of Donald Trump. So regardless, let's go from the West Coast to the East Coast and look at the recent polls that have been conducted and determine who will win in each and every one of these states. So let's start with Washington. So in the state of Washington, Kennedy's poll, and remember Kennedy's poll was sponsored by himself, so take it with a grain of salt, but it has Kennedy leading by about 19 percentage points. So I think this is pretty indicative of who will win in Washington. So let's go to Oregon. And Oregon has Kennedy leading by a lesser margin, but still 4 percentage points, and that's enough to bring him over the edge. So he leads Trump 167 to 119 currently. But to see actually who will win this election, we need to go to the swing states, like Nevada. Let's see what happens in Nevada. So Trump does lead in Nevada, which can show that Trump does win in the swing states against RFK Jr. But we can only come to that conclusion after we see some more swing states, such as the state of Arizona. So Trump also leads in Arizona by pretty significant margins. So he's catching up. He's at 136 to RFK Jr.'s 167. One thing to note is Trump is doing way better in the West Coast than he does against Biden. And this is probably because RFK Jr. is more of an East Coast family. The Kennedys are known for being from the Northeast. And one other interesting thing to note is that RFK Jr.'s family, in fact, doesn't actually support him. They support Biden. But in the case where Biden drops out, I assume his family would support him over Donald Trump. So that thorn in RFK Jr.'s side would probably be eliminated if Biden drops out. Anyways, let's go to Utah, where, like I said, RFK Jr. is leading Trump due to that independently minded state. But I do think if RFK Jr. is a Democrat, a full-on Democrat, he would lose the state of Utah because I think they like the fact that he ran as an independent, but him being a Democrat would make people want to vote for Trump. So for that reason, Trump would win the state of Utah, but not by the safe margins that he would win against Biden. So now let's go to Colorado. Colorado is a bit of a closer state, but it has Kennedy up by 12. So between Trump and Biden, it's closer, but between Kennedy and Trump, it is not very close. So now we go to New Mexico. And New Mexico also has Kennedy up by about 10 percentage points. I think this is about right. Maybe it'll be a little closer than the poll suggests. Because remember, Oregon was pretty close. So RFK Jr. does lead 182 to 142. But Texas can tie up the race if Trump ends up winning. So in the state of Texas, Trump does lead RFK Jr., not by significant margins, but by enough for us to classify that it's a Trump victory. So Trump is tied with RFK Jr., and this is pretty much a nail-biter. RFK Jr. is doing a better job than Biden is against Donald Trump, but most of these polls are skewed more towards RFK Jr. as they were sponsored by him. So let's go to Iowa. Iowa, you may have been surprised that it's not a safe state, and you may even be even more surprised that it's going to RFK Jr., though I do think it will go to Donald Trump if RFK Jr. is backed by the Democrats. I think RFK Jr. would do much better if he ran as an independent and there was no Democrat opposition than if he ran as a Democrat. And the reason Iowa is so close is, even though you might know Iowa, it's like a farming state, it's like a little bit rural, but Iowa actually went to Obama. It seems like so long ago, but it actually went to Obama, and Trump actually flipped it. So Iowa is not much of a safe Republican state, but I do view it does go to Donald Trump here. So now we get to Minnesota, and this is the Midwest. The Midwest tends to decide most elections. It decided the election in 2016. It decided it in 2020. Will it decide it between RFK Jr. and Donald Trump? Honestly, I think it will. And Minnesota does go to Kennedy. So Kennedy does lead Trump currently, but we have to look at some of the other swing states in the Midwest to come to a conclusion. So Wisconsin does go to Donald Trump, just barely, but it goes to Trump nonetheless. And remember, one of Trump's biggest factors that discourages some people from voting for him is the fact that he got his start from his father, who was very wealthy, etc. RFK Jr. has this, but on steroids. RFK Jr.'s parents were not only wealthy, but they were also in the political sphere. So RFK Jr.'s biggest asset is being part of the Kennedy family, but also his biggest drawback. He may seem out of touch to the average person, etc. And so now we get to Michigan, and Michigan is a closer state than most. Michigan does go to RFK Jr., but just barely. So RFK Jr. does lead Donald Trump. But I think this is going to change, particularly with the state of Ohio. Ohio has been going to Republicans in recent elections, and it will go to Donald Trump against RFK Jr. by 8. That's actually interesting. Trump's magic number with Ohio is 8. He always wins Ohio by 8. He'll win it by 8 against RFK Jr., and now he's in the lead. So let's actually go to Florida. Florida is where Trump resides, as well as where his potential VP pick, Marco Rubio, resides. So let's see who wins in the state of Florida. And it's Trump, obviously. RFK Jr. is a little out of touch to Floridians, but Trump is not. Trump lives in Florida. Trump's now the Florida man, if you will, so he appeals to Floridians. And now we get to Georgia. So Kennedy does lead in the state of Georgia, but just barely. He wins by margins like Biden won back in 2020. And Trump is still leading against RFK Jr. So now let's go to Virginia. This is where RFK Jr. got his law degree. He has some ties to the state of Virginia. Trump really does not. And Kennedy does lead in Virginia against Donald Trump. So he's now trailing by only 9 electoral votes against President Trump. So now we get to North Carolina. One interesting fact about North Carolina is it has been shifting more and more to the Democrats in every single election. So maybe North Carolina will flip in this election. No, it will not. Trump does lead in the state of Florida, and now he's up 261 to 236. He only needs to win 9 more electoral votes to win this election. Will he get it from New Jersey? New Jersey has been very promising for Donald Trump in recent polls, but it does go to Kennedy. Kennedy picks up the state of New Jersey, and now it's 250 to 261. But 2 percentage points is very, very close. Trump is doing really well in the state of New Jersey. But let's go to another state in the tri-state area, Pennsylvania. So Trump does lead in the state of Pennsylvania, and he wins the election as a whole, 280 to 250. But we still got more states to go. Let's give Nebraska second to RFK Jr. since Biden won it in 2020. Maine second to Trump since Trump won it in 2020. And then let's see what happens with New Hampshire. New Hampshire went to Trump over Nikki Haley, which is pretty promising for Donald Trump. But it does go to Kennedy in the primary, so Kennedy does pick up New Hampshire. And let's see what happens with Maine. So Maine does go to Kennedy. So overall, it's 257 to Kennedy, 281 to Trump. So Kennedy does put up the best fight so far in this election, but take these polls with a grain of salt. Like, subscribe, and comment for more, and thank you.